Hello everyone, welcome back to The Dark One. I know that many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be fun if everyone left a comment letting me know where you're listening from in the world. If you're enjoying the case, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, get comfy, relax, and let's begin. Mark and Max had been on the road since the early hours of the morning. Their old, rattling van struggled along the narrow back roads winding through the humid Louisiana bayou, where moss-draped cypress trees and ancient oak groves formed a natural cathedral under a twilight sky. The area had a particular hush, as though every branch and vine harbored its own hidden secret, an unspoken invitation into a world of silent mysteries. Although the GPS was generally useful, it was no match for the labyrinthian side streets of New Orleans' outlying neighborhoods. Here, the thick canopy overhead often interfered with reception, and the narrow alleys twisted unpredictably, evoking the sense that roads themselves could rearrange under the moonlight. Mark, who clutched the van's worn leather steering wheel with practiced ease, was used to relying on his intuition rather than technology. By now, he had taken so many side trips and detours that Max's phone, which was attempting to navigate, had practically given up, offering nothing but a spinning icon. "You'd think, with modern satellites, we could find our way," Max grumbled, leaning forward to squint at the dimly lit street sign they were passing. A wrought iron post, rusted from years of enduring the swampy climate, bore only half-legible letters. He gave up with a sigh, placing the phone in his lap. Mark glanced at him with a faint, knowing smile. In a place like this, technology has its limits. Ever notice how every brick and every cobblestone here seems to hold a secret? Max, who had only recently become Mark's assistant, peered out the window at the shifting silhouettes in the distance. Black, twisted branches arching overhead, and the occasional glimmer of swamp water reflecting moonlight. A chill prickled the back of his neck, an odd feeling given the muggy heat. It's like every abandoned mansion or old cemetery has a ghost story of its own, he replied with a nervous laugh. The locals talk about haunted plantations, mysterious voodoo rituals, spectral figures roaming the French Quarter at midnight. Mark nodded in quiet agreement, tapping his hand on the steering wheel as the van bumped over a crooked stretch of road. Exactly. You can feel the weight of New Orleans' history in the air, like the city itself has a soul. Its past is laced with tragedy, mysticism, and secrets. But we're not here for mere stories this time. We're here to see what's really going on. Their destination was the home of a woman named Maria, a local who claimed that something sinister had occupied her house, robbing her of sleep. Ordinarily, Mark's work took him to creaking apartments above storefronts in the French Quarter, or to old estates in the Garden District, where restless spirits were said to wander the ornate halls. But Maria's case was different. Every detail in her plea sounded simultaneously unique and urgent. After more than an hour of weaving through roads lined with century-old live oaks and wrought iron fences, they finally pulled up to their destination, a stately Creole mansion perched on a secluded lane. The architecture spoke of old wealth and family legacies, with tall columns supporting a wide veranda and shuttered windows that had likely witnessed generations come and go. Manicured hedges bordered the property, framing vibrant flower beds reminiscent of an old southern courtyard. A sprawling lawn stretched beyond, adorned with antique statuary, cherubs and angels with faces made mossy by time and climate. Max gaped at the refined elegance. He hadn't expected something so regal out in the countryside. As soon as the van squeaked to a halt, the heavy front door swung open and a woman emerged. Though she appeared poised and graceful, dark circles beneath her eyes betrayed many sleepless nights. She looked to be in her late 40s, although, under kinder circumstances, she might have passed for younger. "Good afternoon, I'm Mark," he greeted warmly as he stepped out, offering a polite nod. "And this is Max, my assistant. You must be Maria." Maria returned the greeting with a weary smile. "Yes, thank you for coming all this way." She regarded them for a moment as though measuring whether they could truly help her, then gestured for them to enter. "Please, come inside. I'm desperate for answers." Inside, the mansion was a tapestry of history and taste. The foyer opened onto gleaming hardwood floors, dark and polished so perfectly that Max could almost see his own reflection as they walked. The walls were lined with an eclectic mix of antiques and modern art, gilded portraits of ancestors alongside contemporary paintings splashed with bold colors. This striking contrast hinted at a lineage that valued tradition while still embracing modern creativity. Overhead, exposed wooden beams stretched across the ceilings, and the soft glow of a large chandelier bathed the space in warm, golden light. Max let out a low whistle of appreciation. "Your home is spectacular. Thank you," Maria said succinctly, though sadness weighed on her voice. "But it's been a nightmare for weeks. I barely sleep at night, footsteps, whispers, sometimes a raspy noise that makes my skin crawl. And when I do manage to drift off, I have these dreams. Or, I'm not even sure if they're dreams. I see myself lying in bed, but I'm completely still, like a lifeless version of me. And there's something in the room watching me." She shuddered, hugging herself as though to hold in her fear. Despite the elegant lines of her face and the meticulous grooming of her hair, she radiated fatigue. Mark, ever observant, crossed the foyer with an air of calm confidence. "How long has this been going on?" Maria closed her eyes for a moment as if replaying the past few weeks. "It started about 2 months after my mother died. I fell into a deep depression, felt empty inside. Then these disturbances began. At first, I shrugged it off as nightmares or sleep paralysis, but the feeling is different. It's as though there's a shadow leaning over me, reaching for me." Mark listened with intense focus, nodding occasionally. Max could see him mentally cataloging her words, matching them against the many paranormal tales he'd studied and encountered firsthand. "You mentioned hearing whispers," Mark said. "Did you ever make out any words or phrases?" "They're too soft to understand," Maria replied, shaking her head. "It's more like hissing, a low, hushed hiss." Max shifted, feeling a faint tremor of unease. The mention of hissing conjured images of serpent-like entities or malevolent shadows. He'd heard rumors of such beings in old folk tales from the bayou, shapes that glided through the midnight gloom, feeding on fear or other intangible energies. They followed Maria down a corridor bathed in gentle lamplight. A subtle smell of lavender polish and wood oil filled the air, reminding Max of old libraries. Along the hallway walls hung various paintings, some depicting the rolling Mississippi landscapes in bright, impressionistic strokes, others capturing centuries-old portraits of severe-looking individuals in high-collared attire. Max's gaze caught on one painting in particular. It was a sunlit scene of a southern village, complete with white cottages and a tall steeple in the distance. Yet, tucked into the lower left corner was a ghostly outline of a figure, face veiled and nearly transparent. The figure's eyes, if it had them at all, seemed eerily fixed on whoever stood before the painting. Max felt goosebumps ripple along his arms, as though the image itself breathed with some hidden life. Maria must have noticed his reaction, for she offered a faint, knowing smile. "That painting's been in my family for generations. The legend says that the artist, a woman from the 19th century, was tormented by visions of the past." People claimed her works contained hidden images of phantoms. Despite Max's curiosity, there was no time to inquire further. They reached Maria's bedroom at the end of the corridor, and she pushed open the door, revealing a strikingly beautiful chamber. Light poured in from tall windows dressed in sheer drapes. Beyond the glass stretched a lush garden, alive with bougainvillea and jasmine. Ornate furniture, mahogany dressers, and an upholstered chaise lounge added a sense of timeless class. "And this is where the disturbances occur?" Mark asked, stepping inside. Maria nodded, motioning to the four-poster bed. Although the pillows and blankets were arranged with careful precision, the sheets were slightly rumpled, telling of the restless night she'd endured. "I hear the footsteps here. I see that presence hovering over me in the dead of night." As she spoke, she rubbed her arms and looked toward a large oval mirror framed in intricate silver filigree that resembled tangled vines. The mirror stood across from the bed, angled in such a way that a sleeper could see their own reflection as soon as they opened their eyes. Mark took note immediately. "You mentioned that you feel watched. Have you noticed anything unusual about the mirror itself? Sounds or changes in its reflection?" Maria hesitated, glancing at the mirror. "Sometimes I think I see shapes behind me, or behind my reflection. It could be my imagination, but..." Her voice trailed off. Mark's brow furrowed. He moved closer, running his fingertips along the mirror's edge as though testing for a hidden pulse. Max, too, examined the glass. For a second, he thought he detected a subtle shimmer, as if the surface rippled when touched, but that might have been a trick of his mind. "Mirrors can be gateways," Mark said softly, "especially antique ones. In many cultures, they've been seen as portals between the living and spirit realms." Before either Max or Maria could comment, a sudden crash echoed from somewhere below, causing them all to jump. Maria let out a startled gasp, her hand flying to her chest. "Oh, that's probably just the old shelf in the basement," she said shakily. "It happens sometimes, especially when the humidity rises. The wood warps and things tend to fall. Though I keep telling myself it's just that." "Let's take a look," Mark suggested, exchanging a glance with Max. Sometimes these occurrences can be more than just old wood and humidity. They followed Maria down a side staircase into a low-ceilinged basement. The air was cool and musty, illuminated by a single flickering light bulb that swayed with each footstep overhead. Stacks of aged crates were piled against the walls, some marked with dates that made Max's eyes widen. 1872, 1903, 1928. Old steamer trunks sat in one corner, partly covered by a threadbare blanket. Maria moved carefully, as if uneasy in the darkness, explaining that most of these were family heirlooms passed down from generation to generation. Max crouched by a toppled box, lifting the lid cautiously. Inside, he found a collection of thick, leather-bound tomes. The gold lettering on their spines was partially worn, but he could still make out titles like Hauntings in the Mississippi Delta and The Legend of the Midnight Stalker in the Bayou. Leaping through the dusty pages, he noticed elaborate sketches of phantom-like creatures, including one that resembled a tall, dark silhouette with elongated limbs and empty eye sockets. "Spooky stuff," Max muttered, showing Mark a page depicting a ghostly hand reaching out from beneath murky swamp water. Maria exhaled, hugging herself a little tighter. "I had forgotten we even had all these books. My grandmother was fascinated by local lore. And these stories might not be just stories," Mark said thoughtfully, closing one of the books and setting it aside. "New Orleans is known for harboring more than its fair share of restless spirits, especially out here in the older parishes." They returned upstairs, each lost in thought. Mark began laying out his plans. He had brought protective charms, small pouches of blessed salt, and chalk for drawing sigils that would help ward off malevolent forces. Many of these items were stashed in 2 large, battered toolboxes in the back of their van. Toolboxes that, ironically, contained very few traditional tools. Maria watched him arrange his supplies with guarded curiosity. "Will we really need all that?" she asked. "We might," Mark replied. "If we're dealing with a typical poltergeist or residual haunting, a simple cleansing could be enough. But your description suggests something more parasitic. These beings sometimes thrive on emotions like grief, depression, or fear. They can latch onto a mirror, a painting, or any object with a strong history." As dusk gave way to night, the house took on a different character. Shadows elongated in the corridors, and the once inviting room seemed to harbor watchful eyes in every corner. By 10 o'clock, an almost preternatural hush had fallen. A breeze, unseasonably cool, whispered through the trees outside, and the full moon overhead seemed sharper, more pronounced against the sky. Maria insisted on staying in her own bedroom. She refused to surrender her personal space to the entity. Mark admired her resolve and agreed to set up the primary protective circle around her bed. Using chalk and a fine line of blessed salt, he drew a barrier meant to trap or repel the specter should it try to approach. The oval mirror was another concern. If it was truly a gateway, it needed its own seal, so Mark fashioned a ring of salt around its base, chanting a brief incantation under his breath. It wasn't a dramatic ritual, no flashing lights or booming voices, but Max had long since learned not to scoff at Mark's methods. Simple, time-tested practices often worked better than flashy theatrical ones. By 11:30 p.m., the vigil began in earnest. Maria lay under a thin blanket, her eyes shielded by a soft sleep mask that Mark had provided, so she wouldn't startle at any sudden visions. Mark stationed himself near the door, flashlight in one hand and a canister of salt in the other, ready to reinforce their barriers if anything tried to slip past. Max, feeling slightly foolish yet determined, wedged himself into an antique wardrobe near the mirror, keeping the door open just enough to see the reflecting glass. He had a handheld camera at the ready, hoping to record any phenomena. The minutes crept by in tense silence, broken only by Maria's measured breathing and the occasional rustle of Max shifting to find a more comfortable position in the cramped wardrobe. Outside, a lone night bird called, its cry echoing through the thick air like a lost spirit. Then, just before midnight, a tangible shift rippled through the atmosphere, like a sudden drop in air pressure. Max felt it first as a prickling sensation on the back of his neck. The hairs on his arms stood on end, and despite the summer heat, an eerie coldness brushed past him. He leaned forward, focusing on the mirror. At first, it was simply his own reflection staring back, tired eyes peeking from the darkness of the wardrobe. Then, within the mirror's depths, a shadow swirled like ink dispersing in water. Max blinked, thinking it might be an illusion caused by the dim lighting. But the shadow thickened, curling into the shape of a hand that pressed against the inside of the glass, as if trying to push through a barrier. "Nay, nay, now," Max croaked, his voice catching in his throat. Mark snapped to attention, swinging the flashlight beam toward the mirror. The spectral hand extended further, each elongated digit ending in a sort of claw-like tip. It looked unearthly, hovering between the corporeal and the intangible. "Everyone, stay calm," Mark whispered, though his heart was pounding. He signaled to Max to begin scattering salt around the mirror. Max leaped out and circled the mirror's frame with a careful line of grains, creating a glowing boundary that seemed to spark faintly under the moonlit gloom. But the entity was already pushing harder. A swirling, nearly humanoid shape began to emerge from the mirror's surface. It was towering, its form hunched and contorted. The most chilling aspect was the pair of large, luminous yellow eyes. The instant they appeared, they locked onto Maria. Even though she wore the sleep mask, Maria whimpered as though she sensed the unnatural gaze upon her. Mark poured a half circle of salt around Maria's bed. As he did so, he spoke a few firm words under his breath, phrases borrowed from ancient texts on warding and protection. The effect was immediate. A faint bluish glow shimmered across the floor, forming a barrier that halted the entity's approach. A guttural hiss broke the silence, a sound so unnatural it seemed to come from deep within some hidden dimension. The creature recoiled, then turned its attention to Max, who stood, salt canister in one hand, camera in the other, wide-eyed and vulnerable. Faster than Max would have believed possible, the entity lunged. Its form blurred as it traversed the space between the mirror and the foot of the bed in a heartbeat. Max stumbled back, losing his grip on the camera, which clattered to the floor. Cold terror gripped his chest. He felt something brush against him, like a freezing breeze that cut through both flesh and spirit. Suddenly, Mark yanked Max behind the sturdy doorframe, forcing the specter to crash into the door. The creature's form splintered momentarily, swirling like black mist in a gust of wind, as though it struggled to hold itself together in the physical realm. "Take cover," Mark ordered, voice low but resolute. "It can't hurt us too badly. Entities that feed on fear and dreams rarely have the power to inflict real physical harm, unless they've grown exceptionally strong." Max gulped, trying to steady his breathing. He watched with both horror and fascination as the creature lunged again and again at Mark, each time seeming to pass through empty air before dissipating and reforming. It was like watching a furious spirit try to fight a living shadow. By now, Maria was fully awake, having lifted the sleep mask. She stared at the horrific spectacle, jaw slack with disbelief. In the shadowy half-light, the monstrous figure looked almost desperate, like a wild animal searching for a crack in its cage. She locked eyes with Mark, voice trembling. "Is it harmless now?" Mark kept his own gaze on the phantom. Harmless might be too strong a word, but yes, it's contained. That protective circle around your bed is preventing it from getting to you, and the salt ring at the mirror is blocking its return to wherever it came from. The creature let out another hiss, flailing its misty limbs as it sought an unguarded escape route. A sizzling, crackling sound filled the air each time it tested the salt lines around the mirror, like static electricity finding no place to discharge. "We keep watch until dawn," Mark explained, glancing at Max. "These entities often draw power from the darkness. By sunrise, it'll be too weak to remain here." And so the night progressed in a tense standoff. The entity paced the perimeter of the room, testing both the mirror's salt barrier and the protective circle around Maria's bed. Sometimes it drifted near the bedroom door, as though probing the house for other potential gateways. But Mark and Max had taken precautions earlier in the evening, sealing every reflective surface and window with small salt pouches and chalk symbols. Exhausted and still vibrating with adrenaline, Maria let Mark guide her from the bedroom for short breaks to help her calm down. In the kitchen, cozy and rustic with old wooden cupboards and a large farm-style table, Max found herbal tea in one of the cupboards, and Mark brewed it quickly. The aroma of chamomile and lavender filled the air, lending a momentary comfort that contrasted starkly with the supernatural conflict raging upstairs. They returned to the bedroom just before dawn, unwilling to leave the creature unobserved for too long. By then, it had grown sluggish, its movements less focused, its hisses soft and strained. The shapes it formed seemed less stable, flickering as though it were an image on a failing projector. Then, the first rays of the rising sun broke over the horizon, filtering through the tall windows. With a final, faint shriek, the shadow creature dissolved like mist in bright light, leaving behind no trace but a faint shimmer along the mirror's surface. Cracks, fine as spider webs, etched the glass, testament to the entity's frantic attempts to escape. Maria exhaled a trembling breath, a mix of relief and residual fear. "I can't believe it's really over," she said, her eyes scanning the room as though expecting another attack. Mark offered a reassuring smile, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "You're free now. The barrier kept it contained. Once these creatures can't return to their realm before the sun rises, they lose their hold." Max stepped around the mirror carefully, mindful not to break the salt line until Mark gave the all clear. The air felt notably lighter, as if a heavy weight had been lifted from the mansion's atmosphere. "Still," Mark continued, turning to Maria, "I'd advise performing a thorough cleansing ritual in the house to clear out any lingering negative energy. And it might be a good idea to replace that mirror or, at the very least, store it away properly. These objects can sometimes retain traces of what passed through." Down in the kitchen, a warm, inviting space that felt worlds apart from the haunted tension they'd just endured, Maria flipped on the lights. Sunlight streamed through a window above the sink, illuminating a pastel collection of plates on a dish rack. The comforting clatter of cups and plates replaced the haunting hush of the night as Maria prepared a simple breakfast of pancakes and hot coffee, complete with cane syrup and fresh butter. "Thank you," she said, voice thick with emotion, once all three were settled at the table. "I truly don't know if I could have survived another night of that presence leeching off my sleep. That's why we're here," Mark replied, voice gentle but firm. He glanced at Max, who grinned faintly around a mouthful of pancake. After the terror they'd just faced, the mundane pleasure of breakfast felt oddly surreal. By the time they finished eating, the sun had fully risen, casting its comforting glow over the lush garden visible through the kitchen window. Birds chirped among the flowers, and the oppressive night felt like a distant memory. Although Maria still looked exhausted, her eyes held a new spark of relief and hope. They said their final goodbyes on the veranda. Maria stood between the stately columns, the morning light catching on the slight silver in her hair. She clasped Mark's hand with genuine gratitude and then turned to Max. "Thank you both," she repeated softly. "You've given me back my home and my peace of mind." Outside, the battered van was waiting. The old engine turned over with a grumble that Max now found reassuring, almost comforting, and anchored to the real, tangible world. As they loaded their gear, Mark couldn't resist a final glance at the mansion, with its proud facade and hidden secrets. The swirling canopy of oak trees and the faint mist rolling off the bayou made for a picturesque scene, but the memory of what had transpired overnight lent the house an air of renewed mystery. "Ready for the next case?" Mark asked quietly as he slid behind the wheel, shutting the creaky driver's door. Max fastened his seatbelt with a tired laugh. "Absolutely, though maybe after a solid nap. I won't complain if we have a case that's just, a squeaky old floorboard for once." Mark chuckled as the van pulled away from the estate and onto the country road. "Knowing this city and the surrounding bayous, I wouldn't count on it." The sun was already high above the swampland, burning off the last of the morning fog. In the distance, cypress trees and Spanish moss swayed gently, and an alligator's silhouette glided across the still waters of a nearby marsh. As they drove, The lingering sense of the supernatural receded into the landscape like a half-forgotten dream. But Mark knew better than to think it was gone entirely. In a place where every brick and every cobblestone whispered secrets of the past, there were always new tales to uncover, new corners of the bayou that concealed stories waiting to be told. And so the van rattled onward, leaving behind one conquered nightmare as Mark and Max set their sights on whatever eerie adventure New Orleans had yet to unveil. I am Teresa, 28 years old, born and raised in the timeless soul of New Orleans. The city's humid warmth, the brackish aroma of the Mississippi mingling with the tang of spicy cuisine, and the low hum of jazz drifting through the French Quarter at night shaped me from childhood. After graduating from Tulane University with a degree in communications, a promising job opportunity in Baton Rouge pulled me away from my beloved hometown. Originally, I planned to stay there for no more than a year. Yet, as it often happens in life, that single year stretched to 3. During those 3 years, I regularly returned to New Orleans like a migratory bird drawn to its ancestral home. My parents and siblings still lived in the old family shotgun house near Bywater, a historic neighborhood dotted with vibrant Creole cottages. My college friends, many of whom never left the city, waited for me on the weekends to catch up at the local bars, where the music of brass bands shook the walls and glasses clinked until dawn. And if there was one thing I clung to the most, it was the city's endless tapestry of legends. Stories of ghosts, voodoo curses, and lost souls wandering the cobblestone streets. No matter how comfortable my new life in Baton Rouge became, my heart stayed tethered to New Orleans. Every 2 or 3 weeks, I'd pack up my car with small gifts for my family. Fresh pastries from a Baton Rouge bakery, or sometimes dusty old books on Louisiana history I'd find in thrift stores, and make the roughly hour-and-a-half drive down Interstate 10. Yet, it was Highway 90 that truly captivated me. Something about its slower stretches, the cypress trees looming on either side, and the black water creeping close to the roadside made it feel like slipping back in time. I've always enjoyed night drives. There's a certain tranquility in the darkness, a silence broken only by the wheels humming against the asphalt and the occasional hoot of an owl perched in the swamps. For me, those hours were a form of meditation, a chance to organize my thoughts or simply tune in to an old blues station. Little did I know how drastically my perception of night drives would change after one fateful journey. It was close to 2 o'clock in the morning on a particularly moonless night. I had attended a late social event in Baton Rouge, a colleague's farewell dinner, so I left later than usual. The sky was inky black, and not a star was visible behind the heavy clouds. Highway 90 was almost deserted, save for a distant pair of headlights every 20 miles or so. The only illumination came from my car's high beams and the sporadic glimmer of aging streetlights near small towns. As I navigated a gentle curve in the road, I realized the highway was weaving closer to the Mississippi River. It's not unusual to spot stray wisps of fog hovering above the water. This is Louisiana after all. But that night, the fog banks were thicker and more ominous than I had ever seen. Streaks of white vapor clung to the river's surface, shifting as though guided by unseen hands. I was approaching a stretch where the river bends quite sharply, overshadowed by gnarled oaks swathed in Spanish moss. That's when I noticed a peculiar movement on the bank. A misty form, stark against the darkness, gliding toward the road in a single, cohesive mass. It wasn't dissipating into tendrils like normal fog. My instincts pricked at the unnatural sight, and I slowed to a cautious speed. Suddenly, a large, gray-white shape appeared directly in front of my car. Alarmed, I slammed on the brakes. The tires squealed, and my car shuddered to a halt. In that split second, my headlights illuminated something. Something neither solid nor wholly translucent. Its outline was strikingly well defined, like a spectral silhouette with edges too sharp for regular mist. For the briefest moment, I felt it looking at me, or rather, through me. Then, as quickly as it came, it seemed to vanish back into the fog, leaving me shaken and breathless in the middle of the highway. My heart hammered in my chest for what felt like an eternity. Questions ricocheted inside my mind. Was it a trick of the light? A low-hanging cloud reflecting my beams at a strange angle? Logic failed to calm the surge of icy fear that coursed through me. At last, I mustered the courage to drive on, double-checking the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting that misty apparition to reappear behind me. Weeks passed before I mentioned what I'd seen to anyone. I chalked it up to exhaustion or overactive imagination. My next few trips between Baton Rouge and New Orleans were thankfully uneventful, until one particular night when I was returning home for a friend's birthday celebration. It was around 3:30 a.m., and again, the road was eerily quiet. The radio fizzled in and out of static, occasionally finding a station that played old Zydeco tunes. As I cruised along a segment of Highway 90 that cut through dense swamp, I spotted a lone figure walking at the edge of the road. This wasn't entirely unusual. Some local fishermen set out before dawn. But as my headlights panned over him, I noticed the shabby, threadbare coat he wore, something far too heavy for Louisiana's climate. He also held a tall, twisted cane that looked as if it had been carved from a knotted cypress branch. Cautious, I slowed down, worried he might stumble into traffic. But then he turned to face me, and I nearly lost my grip on the steering wheel. Where his face should have been, there was only shadow and two deep red eyes glowing with an unearthly, malevolent light. The sight of those eyes sent chills rolling up my spine, and an abrupt, suffocating sense of dread seized me. I pressed the gas pedal almost involuntarily, racing past him. My peripheral vision caught the briefest flicker of movement, as if he made a slight motion with his cane, pointing or beckoning in my direction. The memory of those eyes burned itself into my psyche, refusing to fade. No more than 10 miles down the road, a shape materialized again in front of my headlights. This time, it looked like a canine creature, hunched and unnaturally tall, balancing on its hind legs with the same red, glowing eyes. A raw, inexplicable terror shook me. I braced myself, fully expecting an impact, but in the blink of an eye, the creature dissolved into the darkness. My knuckles whitened from gripping the steering wheel, and I prayed silently to every deity I could recall, just to make it to the next lit street without further incident. If the first two encounters felt like surreal nightmares, the third was the one that made me question my entire understanding of reality. By then, I had tried to rationalize the sightings. Perhaps it was stress, or my eyes playing tricks. But nothing could explain away what happened next. Again, I was on Highway 90, heading southwest from Baton Rouge toward New Orleans. It was 2:30 a.m. on a night thick with humidity. I remember the air felt suffocating, as though the atmosphere itself was burdened by something invisible. Not a single car appeared in my rearview mirror for miles. The only company I had was a low buzz from the radio and the rhythmic beat of my heart, which seemed to get louder the closer I got to the river. All at once, my car beeped with a warning. The tire pressure sensor indicated a rapid loss of air. I hoped it was a faulty sensor, but the light persisted. Reluctantly, I pulled over to the side, a place so remote that even the glow of the nearest town's lights was too faint to see. My phone showed no signal, which wasn't entirely surprising in rural Louisiana, but it added to my sense of isolation. I stepped out, immediately greeted by a heavy stillness. The cypress and willow trees stood like silent sentinels, their long branches swaying gently in a breeze I could barely feel. Checking the back right tire with my flashlight, I found it completely flat. I sighed and rummaged for the spare, figuring I could manage the tire change quickly. I'd done it before. That was when I heard it. Heavy footfalls on the pavement behind me, pacing steadily closer. Not a frantic run, but a deliberate, almost menacing rhythm. My flashlight flickered across the asphalt, revealing a tall figure in the distance, too far to discern details, yet close enough to notice an oddly elongated shape. A primordial fear gripped me as I realized it was getting closer with each thudding step. My breath caught, and my limbs felt paralyzed. In a desperate burst of energy, I flung myself into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and locked it. Inside the car, I fumbled with the keys, adrenaline making my hands tremble uncontrollably. The engine stubbornly refused to turn over, as if the battery had died in those few seconds. That's when scratching began at the passenger side door. Light at first, then louder, more deliberate, like someone or something testing the barrier between us. A deep, ragged exhalation followed, so close to the window that I could see the faint cloud of condensation forming on the glass. In that moment, my chest felt tight with claustrophobic terror. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for the engine to catch. And then, without warning, the car roared to life. I slammed the accelerator, ignoring the horrid thumping of the ruined tire. The car lurched forward, scraping the rim against the asphalt, but I refused to stop for a second look. I sped on, convinced that if I dared glance in the rearview mirror, I'd see those red eyes staring back at me from the darkness. I told no one about my experiences, fearing they'd think I was unraveling under stress. But the encounters gnawed at my psyche, replaying in nightmares that woke me in a cold sweat. Finally, over café au lait and beignets, at a small stand in the French market, I confessed bits and pieces of my story to my close friend, James. He had also spent time commuting between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, and knew how eerie those roads could be in the dead of night. To my utter surprise, James fell silent, a grave look washing over his face. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a worn, leather-bound notebook. Inside were hand-scribbled notes, dated from a couple of years prior. References to seeing a man with a cane and glowing eyes on Highway 90, mentions of a canine-like specter with a similar red gaze, and even bizarre sketches of amorphous fog forming recognizable silhouettes. Reading his entries, I felt a jolt of recognition that made the hair on my arms stand up. Someone else had seen the same horrors and documented them meticulously. When I casually brought up these incidents with locals in certain pockets of New Orleans, an old voodoo supply shop near Rampart Street, a small diner in Treme, or a bar tucked away behind the Marigny, I noticed a recurring pattern of hushed voices and cautious glances. One evening, I ended up chatting with the elderly proprietor of a mom-and-pop grocery store, a corner establishment that had been in his family for generations. When he asked why I looked so preoccupied, I confided in him, carefully, not wanting to sound insane. The old man leaned in, eyes scanning the store to ensure no one else was within earshot, and whispered, "They's old stories about the red-eyed wanderers. Ain't many folks round here like to talk about it, but my grandpappy told me some of them lost souls can't find peace on either side of the grave. They roam the roads and the bayou, and if you see 'em once, they mark you." He spoke of legends older than the city itself. Spirits bound to the waters and the land by some ancient curse or grief, able to adopt multiple forms. Sometimes they appeared as forlorn travelers, other times as shadowy beasts. Children, he said, were once warned never to wander too close to the Mississippi after sunset because of these very apparitions. Hearing this, I felt a mix of dread and grim validation. I wasn't losing my mind. There was a thread connecting my encounters to the age-old folklore of Louisiana. Eventually, my 3-year stint in Baton Rouge came to a close. My contract ended, and I decided it was time to move home permanently. By that point, every nighttime drive haunted me with the possibility of seeing those terrible red eyes. So, I made a plan to travel during daylight as much as possible. Yet, in a twist of cruel fate, my moving schedule dragged longer than expected. By the time I loaded the last of my boxes and said goodbye to neighbors, dusk was already settling over the sky. As I merged onto Highway 90 for what I promised myself would be the last time, I glanced anxiously at the darkening horizon. The shoulders of the road seemed narrower than ever, and the looming silhouettes of cypress trees looked like silent watchers. Each mile seemed to stretch further, each bend in the road an invitation to something lurking just beyond my line of sight. A strange tension gripped me throughout the drive. My eyes darted to every patch of shadow, every swirl of fog near the water. But no figures appeared, no red glows pierced the gloom. Despite the lack of a direct encounter, I could not shake the sense of being watched, an invisible presence trailing me like a spectral guardian or tormentor. By the time I finally glimpsed the lights of New Orleans, I exhaled in sheer relief. My old neighborhood in Bywater felt like a sanctuary. My parents rushed out to greet me as I parked in front of the creaky iron gate, and my younger sister teased me for looking so pale. But despite their warmth, a part of me felt tethered to the terror I'd left behind on that road. To this day, my thoughts return to those nights on Highway 90. I sometimes sit on the porch of our shotgun house, a glass of sweet iced tea in hand, listening to the distant buzz of cicadas and remembering the scratching at my car door, the stifling hush of the deserted highway, and the oppressive gaze of those red eyes. James and I have compared notes countless times, trying to decipher some pattern. We learned that, scattered among local legends, references to the red-eyed wanderers pop up in different forms. Some attribute these apparitions to old voodoo curses cast on unsuspecting travelers. Others suggest they're the restless spirits of those who perished along the Mississippi's banks, victims of shipwrecks, floods, or even unsolved crimes. There's no official record, of course, no rational explanation that the modern world would accept. Yet, the stories persist, passed down in whispered warnings to children and travelers alike. I can't deny that I'm still deeply unsettled whenever I recall the events of those nights. Some part of me wonders if those entities remain forever bound to that stretch of highway, or if, having once set eyes on me, they might someday follow me into the city. I've caught myself peering out my bedroom window after midnight, half expecting to see a hunched figure with a cane, waiting under the flickering street lamp at the corner. If there's one lesson I've learned through these experiences, it's that some roads hold more secrets than we're ready to face. In New Orleans, we live alongside mysteries that have endured since before the city's founding. We see them in the cryptic symbols etched into above-ground tombs, in the half-forgotten spiritual traditions handed down by voodoo priestesses, and in the languid flow of the Mississippi, which has claimed and concealed countless stories over the centuries. Should you ever find yourself driving down a desolate Louisiana highway in the darkest hours of the night, I urge you to remember my story. Stay alert. Trust that primal feeling in the pit of your stomach, the one that warns you when something is off. Resist the temptation to pull over unless absolutely necessary, and if fate forces you to stop, pray that whatever walks the night passes you by. Because in a place where the veil between this world and the next is paper thin, it doesn't take much to slip into a realm of shadows and restless spirits. I came back from that realm but not without scars, emotional, psychological, and not without the lingering fear that one day I might see those red eyes staring at me once more, illuminated by my headlights in the lonely dark. So ends my extended testimony, a longer and more detailed account of the nightmare that Highway 90 became for me. May these words serve as both a cautionary tale and a glimpse into the very real possibility that our roads, our lives, and our souls might sometimes intersect with phenomena we cannot understand. I first came to New Orleans because I needed a change, an escape from the mundane routines that had defined my life for so long. A year ago, I packed what little I owned into my battered old sedan, leaving behind the uniform lawns and identical houses of my home state. New Orleans seemed like the right place to begin anew. A city with a pulse all its own, where history drifts through the streets as tangibly as the Mississippi River itself. When I arrived, it was mid-afternoon, and the sun cast an almost theatrical light on the city's architecture. My new home stood in the heart of the French Quarter, tucked between two more modern-looking buildings. In contrast, the house itself had a worn elegance, boasting wrought iron balconies adorned with curling vines of ivy. The shutters were a faded olive green, peeling at the corners, revealing layers of paint from older eras. One look, and I knew it had stood witness to countless stories, from the time of horse-drawn carriages and gas lanterns to the modern bustle of today's Bourbon Street. Walking along the cobblestone sidewalks for the first time, I felt almost like an intruder stepping into another century. Street performers played saxophones and violins on corners, their music echoing from cracked brick walls. Tourists meandered in colorful clothing, cameras and phones at the ready, marveling at the swirling ferns that dangled over iron railings. A carriage horse clopped by, the driver tipping his hat to passers-by, and always, at every turn, you could smell a mingling of fresh beignets, chicory coffee, and the heavier scents of incense drifting out of voodoo shops. Beneath that veneer of carnival-like vibrancy lay an older, quieter undercurrent, like shadows dancing in the corners of your vision. It was in the hush of an alleyway, in the flicker of a street lamp at dusk, or in the whispering hush of oak trees draped with Spanish moss in the nearby garden district. I felt it the moment I stepped out of my car. This was a city not quite like any other, a place unafraid to blend the mundane with the mystical. My landlady, Mrs. Maribel Duproux, was waiting at the entrance, leaning lightly on a carved walking cane. She was a petite woman, well into her 70s, with silver hair pinned in a tight bun, giving her an air of old-world grace. She greeted me with a polite but restrained smile. "I'm pleased you made it safely," she said, her soft Louisiana accent smoothing the words. "We don't get many long-term renters in this part of the quarter, especially young students." She handed over a single key on a wrought iron keychain shaped like a fleur-de-lis. "That key is 100 years old at least," she informed me. "Keep it safe. Locks in this house like to stay loyal to the original hardware." As we ventured into the townhouse's interior, a hush seemed to fall. The corridor stretched ahead, the walls lined with faded wallpaper patterned with climbing vines. Wooden floors creaked beneath every step. One corner of the hall was occupied by an antique chair, its upholstery worn to threads. Everything smelled faintly musty, like old books and memories left to rest in darkened rooms. "This house has old bones," Mrs. Dupree commented, tapping the wall gently with her cane. "Old memories, too. If you ever feel uneasy, just talk to it. Let it know you're here in peace." She gave a half laugh, as if it was a joke, but her eyes remained serious. I offered a small smile in return, unsure how to respond. I'd heard rumors of New Orleans' haunted reputation, People spoke of ghosts like they were as common as the city's summer thunderstorms. But I told myself these tales were mostly tourist fodder. Little did I know, of course, just how literal her warning was. My new apartment occupied the second floor. Sunlight filtered through tall windows at odd angles, casting pale bars of light on the hardwood floor. I found the living room cozy, if outdated. A large fireplace with an ornate mantel, built-in shelves, and a chandelier drooping from the ceiling. The mantel displayed a few old figurines, a porcelain cat, a small angel, left behind by previous tenants or possibly by the original owners. The place emanated a sense of weighty history that both intrigued and unsettled me. I arranged my few belongings, stacking books on the dusty shelves and placing bright throw pillows on the couch in an attempt to bring color to the gloomy interior. Chili, my black and white cat who had traveled with me, sniffed around curiously, tail fluffed with apprehension. He prowled from room to room, pausing at closed doors as though expecting someone to open them from the other side. Despite the house's dark corners, I was eager to start this new chapter. My master's program in history, with a specialization in Southern folklore, was set to begin at a local university just outside the quarter. I spent the first few weeks attending orientation sessions, meeting professors, and forging friendships with classmates who hailed from all over the country. We bonded over coffee and late-night study groups, often venturing into the quarter afterward to soak up the lively bars or just wander down quiet streets under old lanterns. Little by little, I learned the rhythms of the city. I discovered that the faint sound of distant saxophone music often lulled me to sleep, and that the thick Louisiana humidity could make even the simplest daytime errands feel like wading through warm water. I found a favorite cafe near Jackson Square, where the baristas drew little designs in my latte foam, and a fruit stand that sold the sweetest peaches I had ever tasted. It felt like I was slipping into an alternate universe, somewhere both enthralling and dangerously enchanting. For a time, nothing particularly alarming happened within my new home. I caught glimpses of flickering shadows in the corner of my eye, or sometimes heard footsteps on the stairs when Chili was curled at my feet. But I chalked these up to the house's age. Old wood and old pipes, I reasoned, could create all sorts of illusions. Besides, I'd experienced small supernatural quirks all my life, like lamps that switched themselves off, or doors that sometimes opened if I stared at them too long. I had grown used to brushing these things aside. But then came the first undeniable sign. My favorite turquoise hairbrush disappeared from the bathroom counter. I combed the entire apartment, under sofas, behind doors, even inside the fridge, just to be absolutely sure. No luck. 3 days later, it reappeared in the exact spot I remembered leaving it. Not dusty or out of place, just there, mockingly mundane. I tried not to dwell on it. I was juggling coursework deadlines and social gatherings, so maybe my memory was just playing tricks on me. Yet a part of me couldn't ignore the chill that came whenever I glanced at that hairbrush, as though it had been somewhere beyond my sight, and then decided to return. My friend Madison, a literature major with an obsession for Gothic novels, soon became a regular visitor. She had an adventurous spirit and a fascination with anything eerie, so she was naturally drawn to my old Creole townhouse. One cool Friday evening, I invited her for dinner. We picked up takeout from a nearby gumbo shop and ate in the living room by the soft glow of 2 antique lamps. The walls seemed to hold their breath, listening in on our conversation. At one point, Madison excused herself to the bathroom. When she returned, she wore a puzzled expression. "You're a neat freak, huh?" she teased. I blinked, genuinely confused, as she led me to the bathroom. Every bottle, every tube, lotion, shampoo, soap dispensers, had been lined up in an impossibly straight row, precisely equidistant. I stood there, heart pounding. I certainly hadn't arranged them that way, and Madison looked too genuinely startled to be pulling a prank. An uneasy hush settled over us. Madison broke the silence with a nervous laugh. "Well," she said, trying to lighten the mood, "at least if the house is haunted, it's tidy." I forced a grin, but the incident clawed at my thoughts long after she left. Over the next few weeks, life became a balancing act. By day, I was buried in research papers and group projects, immersing myself in the labyrinthine archives of Louisiana history. By night, small disturbances at home multiplied. Flickers of light in the halls, faint whispers from the attic, or the sensation of being watched as I walked from one room to another. Chili began spending more time under the bed, occasionally staring at nothing with widened eyes. One Saturday morning, I awoke early, intending to enjoy a lazy brunch in the kitchen. Instead, I found an arrangement of silverware on my table. Forks, knives, spoons, all placed in a perfect circle with their handles pointing inward. It was so precise, so meticulous, that it sent a jolt of unease through me. It felt almost like a ritual symbol, though I couldn't decipher its meaning. My hands trembled as I hastily gathered the utensils, scattering them in the sink. If some entity was leaving me messages, I wanted no part of it. Still, I tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. I threw myself into my studies, stayed late at the university library, and joined a small research group exploring Louisiana's Creole culture. We took field trips to old plantations along the river, took notes on Creole architecture, and interviewed local historians who seemed to have a story for every century. My fascination with the city's past deepened, yet a part of me recognized I was living on the edge of something distinctly supernatural. Each day, I wondered if I was inviting more activity by studying the city's haunted history. One of the most jarring incidents occurred after I spent an entire day at the library, poring over archival documents. I returned home well past sunset. The quarter was lively. Tourists snapping photos of costumed street performers, a brass band marching by, the smell of fried foods wafting from open windows. Inside my townhouse, I was greeted by an unsettling sight. The living room was in disarray. An antique armoire, which had been closed and locked since I moved in, stood wide open. Cans of soup, boxes of cereal, bags of rice, all my pantry staples, were stacked in a precarious tower inside it, nearly reaching the top shelf. Chairs had been pushed together in bizarre formations, pillows tossed in corners, and a single dining chair balanced on top of the tower like a crowning piece. It looked like some twisted art installation. Chili was crouched in the corner, eyes darting around the room as if following invisible movements. My heart hammered in my chest. I dropped my backpack on the floor and frantically checked for signs of forced entry. Nothing. Windows and doors were locked as I had left them. Only my key could open the front door, and I had it with me all day. The sense of violation ran deep. For hours, I reorganized everything, replacing cans in the kitchen and returning furniture to its rightful place. The entire time, I felt eyes upon me, as though the house was silently laughing at my efforts. More than once, I glanced over my shoulder, certain I'd see someone lurking in the shadows. But the rooms were empty, just me, Chili, and the echo of my own ragged breathing. On a sweltering evening soon after, I awoke in the middle of the night to a faint scraping sound from downstairs. My first thought was to check on Chili, who, by then, had a habit of disappearing when the disturbances flared up. Morning found me slumped on the living room sofa, half dressed and exhausted from a near sleepless night. As I trudged into the kitchen, I froze. Chili lay in a puddle of bright red liquid that shimmered in the early daylight. My mind immediately jumped to the worst conclusion: blood. Panic surged through me, heart pounding so loudly I could barely think. But when I knelt down, gingerly pressing a hand against Chili's fur, I realized it was ketchup. A glance at my refrigerator confirmed the nearly empty bottle, its lid discarded casually on the counter. Chili, trembling but unharmed, looked up at me with wide, frightened eyes. A wave of anger overwhelmed my initial relief. Up until then, the entity's pranks, while unsettling, had been directed at objects and furniture. Now, it had escalated to targeting a living creature, my cat. It felt personal, a violation of a boundary I hadn't realized I'd set. I cleaned Chili in the sink, gently talking to her in a soothing voice. Then, still drenched in dread, I whispered to the house, "Enough. Stop this, or if you must haunt someone, haunt me, but leave my cat alone." I adopted a new nightly routine, locking Chili in my bedroom with me, sprinkling a bit of salt at the thresholds, an old folk remedy I read about, and leaving a dim lamp on. The nights became a haunted vigil, with distant scraping noises echoing in the attic, and doors opening on their own with groans of protest. Sleep was scarce. My class performance began to slip. Friends noticed the dark circles under my eyes, but I offered excuses. Long study sessions, stress, allergies, anything but the truth. I wasn't ready for people to think I was losing my mind. Then came the morning I discovered the word "stay" scrawled across the bathroom mirror, on the tiles, and even on the porcelain tub. Soap, shampoo, and toothpaste formed a ghostly chorus of letters. The message left me shaking. Whoever or whatever was behind these disturbances had grown bolder, more purposeful, and it was issuing demands now. Struggling to maintain composure, I stumbled into the kitchen, only to find my largest knife standing upright on the table, gleaming under the overhead light. A family photo that I'd brought from my childhood home, my parents and me smiling at a picnic, had been pinned to the wall with the tip of that knife, the rest of it ripped away so that only my face remained intact. My parents' images were shredded. That was the moment the true horror sank in. This was no longer a few ghostly pranks. It was a targeted attack by a presence intent on dominating not just the space, but me. My sense of safety, my cherished memories, my beloved pet. Everything was a piece on its stage of fear. Desperate, exhausted, and terrified, I remembered the cautionary tales my classmates had shared about vengeful spirits in old Creole homes. Some recommended local mediums, others joked nervously about exorcists. My friend Madison had mentioned a voodoo practitioner, Madame Solange, renowned among students and locals alike. People whispered that her family lineage traced back to one of the earliest Creole matriarchs, granting her unique insight into spirits that roamed these parts. Her shop was tucked away on a quiet side street near Jackson Square. From the outside, it appeared unassuming, a small sign reading, "Madame Solange's Remedies and Charms." Inside, the air was thick with the scent of burning sage and myrrh, the shelves lined with jars of dried herbs, powders, and colored candles. The walls were draped in embroidered cloths depicting symbols I didn't recognize. Madame Solange herself was seated behind a wooden counter, her braided hair threaded with small charms and beads. She regarded me with calm, knowing eyes, nodding as though she'd expected my arrival. Leading me behind a velvet curtain, she listened intently to my story without the slightest hint of skepticism. "Your house," she said in a measured tone, "has awoken something old. Sometimes these spirits attach themselves to the land or to the objects within it. Other times, they respond to a person, especially someone with a natural sensitivity to the unseen. she recommended a cleansing ritual, burning specific herbs in every room, reciting prayers in both French and English to respect the city's layered spiritual heritage, and leaving an offering, traditionally a small bowl of sweetened water or rum, meant to appease the restless dead. She also advised me to set firm boundaries. "They must know you will not submit," she said. "But be warned, some entities do not part easily from the places they've claimed." I returned home with sage bundles, a carved white candle, and a small vial of protective oil. The moment I stepped inside, an almost electric tension greeted me, as though the house recognized my new resolve. Chili meowed uneasily from the sofa, her green eyes following something I couldn't see. I lit the sage and began walking through each room, smudging the corners where energy often collects. "You do not belong here," I whispered, my voice trembling but firm. "This is my home now. Whatever unrest you feel, be at peace. I offer you release." I repeated variations of these words, remembering to speak them in French when I could, mindful of the city's Creole roots. The smoke spiraled upwards, clinging to the rafters and swirling in pockets of stale air. In the kitchen, I placed the carved white candle in a small dish of salt and lit it. The flame shimmered, illuminating the old cabinets and worn countertops. Then I left a bowl of sweetened rum, saying, "Take this as a sign of my respect. May we find harmony, or may we part ways." For a brief moment I felt the pressure in the air lessen, as though something had stepped back. But soon after, I heard a heavy thud in the living room. Rushing in, I found one of the armchairs tipped on its side, the cushion yanked out and tossed a few feet away. It felt like a defiant gesture, yet the atmosphere had shifted. The aggression, while present, seemed less suffocating, more uncertain. I spent the rest of the evening repeating prayers and relighting the sage whenever it burned low. Over the next few days, the activity ebbed and flowed. Sometimes I'd find objects rearranged again. Books stacked in odd patterns, drawers yanked open. Other times, the house felt almost peaceful, the new hush feeling like a tenuous truce. Late one night, I heard faint music, distant and tinny, like an old record player spinning a jazz tune from decades past. But it stopped abruptly whenever I tried to trace the source. Then came a violent outburst that shattered my fragile sense of progress. In the early hours of a Monday morning, a thunderstorm rolled in, rattling windows with gusts of wind and sheets of rain. I woke to a deafening crash in the hallway. My bedroom door flew open so hard it banged into the wall, the handle leaving a dent. In the flickering lightning, I saw a shapeless shadow flicker across the ceiling, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. Downstairs, I discovered the living room in chaos. Books flung from shelves, the coffee table overturned, and a spiderweb of cracks in the mirror above the fireplace. Chili cowered behind the sofa, pupils dilated with terror. My heart thundered in my ears as I realized that the entity had not been banished at all. It was fighting back with renewed force. At my wit's end, I called Madison, begging her to come over despite the storm. She arrived drenched, clutching a thick old tome borrowed from the university library. The book, she explained, contained accounts of local Creole rituals and exorcisms carried out in the city's earlier days. Many of them involved a combination of Catholic prayers and African spiritual elements, reflecting the diverse heritage of New Orleans. By candlelight, the two of us began reciting passages, stumbling over archaic French phrases. Outside, lightning illuminated the French Quarter, revealing narrow streets slick with rain and the silhouettes of iron balconies. Inside, every flash exposed the ravaged state of my living room, as though we were in the aftermath of a violent invasion. At one point, as we chanted in unison, the entire house seemed to vibrate. A thunderous crack reverberated through the walls, and the chandelier overhead swung wildly. For a moment, I feared the ceiling would cave in, but then, as quickly as it had begun, the tremors subsided. The candle's flames steadied, no longer dancing like they were caught in a wind tunnel. We waited, breath caught in our throats, expecting another surge of destruction. Yet a profound silence fell. Minutes passed, 10, then 20, with no further disturbances. Madison lowered the book, tears of relief shining in her eyes. I sat down, barely managing to keep from collapsing. The storm outside began to ease, and the tension within the house seemed to ebb with it. In the days that followed, life took on a cautious equilibrium. The house remained old and creaky, occasionally producing strange noises in the night, but the overtly hostile manifestations diminished. Chili emerged from her hiding places more often, though she stayed vigilant, ears perked at the slightest sound. A few times, I still felt a flicker of unease in certain corners, especially the attic, which I'd begun locking from the outside, but nothing as terrifying as before. I visited Madame Solange to thank her and to update her on the situation. She nodded knowingly, reminding me that some entities simply retreat, waiting for the right moment to stir again. Keep practicing your protections, she advised. Show respect, but do not show fear. Fear is the doorway through which they gain strength. Life in New Orleans carried on. The city's calendar of festivals kept everyone buzzing with excitement. Costumed parades filled the streets, brass bands blared at all hours, and spontaneous parties erupted on balconies draped with beads and ribbons. Mardi Gras season arrived in a riot of color and celebration. People danced in the streets under a shower of confetti, sipping daiquiris and cheering as float after float rolled by. For a time, the revelry seemed to chase away the lingering shadows in my life. Still, every so often, I felt the subtle echo of the house's old energy. It was in the hush that descended after midnight, or in the flicker of a candle casting a silhouette that shouldn't quite be there. A soft scraping in the attic. An odd whisper, half heard, as I passed the living room. Each time, I remembered the warnings. Some things lie dormant rather than disappearing entirely. Madison remained a constant support, and we even organized a small study group dedicated to paranormal history. Our goal was to explore how legends had shaped Louisiana's cultural identity. We uncovered tales of restless spirits from antebellum plantations, cryptic sightings in the bayous, and, of course, countless ghost stories from the city's past, the Myrtles plantation, the LaLaurie mansion, and many other infamous locations. With each new discovery, I felt a chill of recognition. I was living in one of those stories, albeit one not yet recorded in any historical archive. These days, the townhouse has fallen into a quieter routine. I still burn sage once a month, walking the halls and corners with whispered prayers. I keep protective talismans near the windows and doorways, small amulets blessed by Madame Solange or found at local voodoo shops. Chili, more comfortable than ever, stretches out in warm patches of sunlight without trembling at every sound. In quieter moments, though, I can't forget what happened. When the wind rattles the shutters late at night, I remember the time my living room was turned upside down by an invisible force. When I set a jar of salt on the kitchen counter, I recall the circle of silverware, arranged like some arcane symbol. The memory of Chili lying in a pool of ketchup, trembling in fear, is impossible to erase. From the outside, my life probably looks normal. I attend classes, write papers, meet friends for coffee, and occasionally join the crowds on Bourbon Street to listen to jazz or sample local cuisine. Yet beneath that ordinary facade, I've gained a profound awareness of how thin the veil between the seen and the unseen can be, especially in a place like New Orleans, where history and spirit coexist as naturally as air and breath. New Orleans is a tapestry woven from the threads of countless cultures. French, Spanish, African, Caribbean, and American, all mingling in the humid air. It's a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead seem more porous than elsewhere. Ghost tours file down the streets nightly, their guides spinning tales of tragic brides and phantom children, of old voodoo queens still roaming the alleys. I sometimes hear the hushed awe of tourists as they pass my townhouse, the guide pointing out old structures rumored to be haunted. They speak of restless spirits as though they're as common as street musicians, and in this city, maybe they are. I've learned to coexist with whatever lingers here. I speak gently to the house sometimes, like one might to a pet or a skittish roommate. I tell it when I'm leaving for the day, and I announce my return at night. There's a sense that the walls are listening, that they're old enough and alive enough to hold a grudge if I don't show proper respect. I keep fresh flowers on the fireplace mantel, an unspoken offering to any presence that might appreciate the gesture. Though I've regained a semblance of peace, I can't pretend the ordeal left me unscarred. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of a dying light bulb might trigger a small surge of anxiety. I suspect that, on some level, the house has claimed a part of me, just as I've claimed it by choosing to remain. Some nights, when the city's revelry has quieted and a hush blankets the quarter, I listen for footsteps on the stairs. I linger in the living room, half expecting the furniture to tremble or rearrange itself once again. But for now, all is still. Perhaps the spirits have returned to their slumber, or perhaps they merely watch from the corners, waiting. Either way, I've learned that in New Orleans, a city radiant with jazz and haunted by its own legends. The line between ordinary life and the supernatural is as thin as a thread of Spanish moss. Here, in this old Creole townhouse, I continue my life, mindful of the secrets hidden in walls, respectful of the energies that share my space. And so, I remain, a wary tenant in a haunted home, buoyed by the vibrancy of the city I've come to love, ever watchful for the moment when the shadows might stir again.